Imagine you're 17 years old. You're standing inside a fortress overlooking Mexico City. Outside the walls, a much larger American army is preparing to attack. Your artillery is running low. Your defenders are exhausted, and you already know something the soldiers around you don't want to say out loud. This fortress probably isn't going to survive the day.
Send the cadets to the wall. It is the only way to buy time.
You have two choices: leave or stay and fight for a position you know you cannot hold. In September 1847, some of Mexico's youngest military cadets faced exactly that choice. And what happened at Chapultepec became one of the most famous stories in Mexican military history. But there's a twist. The battle wasn't really about winning. It was about buying time. September 1847. The Mexican-American War had reached its decisive stage. American forces were advancing toward Mexico City. And this time, the war was no longer happening somewhere far from the capital. The American army was approaching the heart of Mexico. Between the advancing American forces and Mexico City stood Chapultepec, a fortified hill rising above the surrounding landscape. At its summit stood the Mexican Military Academy, and that made Chapultepec more than just another defensive position. It was one of the key points protecting the capital. If Chapultepec fell, the road toward Mexico City would become dangerously open, and the Mexican defenders knew exactly what was coming. But here's what makes this story strange. The Mexican defenders weren't preparing for a battle they believed they could win.
We don't have to defeat them.
They were preparing for a battle they believed they had to fight anyway. Because sometimes a commander doesn't need to defeat an enemy. Sometimes, he only needs to make the enemy lose enough time. And Chapultepec was about to become exactly that kind of battlefield. Mexico was already in a desperate military situation. Its army had suffered repeated defeats. Its soldiers were exhausted. Supplies were limited. And the American army had significant advantages in artillery, organization, and resources. Inside Chapultepec were Mexican soldiers, artillerymen, and cadets from the military academy. Some of these cadets were extremely young. Later, 6 of them would become famous as the Niños Héroes, the boy heroes. Their exact ages and some details of their final actions have been debated by historians, but their presence at Chapultepec is part of the historical record. And on September 12, the Americans began preparing the fortress for destruction. American artillery opened fire. For hours, Chapultepec was bombarded. The sound would have been terrifying. Cannon striking the defensive positions, stone and earth thrown into the air, smoke covering the hill. And behind the defenses, young cadets realizing that this was no longer a training exercise. The artillery was doing its job. It was weakening the fortress before the infantry came. And that was the terrifying part, because everyone inside Chapultepec knew what came next. The guns were only the beginning. Think about that for a moment. You have spent hours watching enemy artillery tear apart the position around you. Then the bombardment suddenly changes. The guns begin to quiet. And you realize why. The enemy isn't stopping. They're coming. American troops began moving toward the hill. The defenders opened fire. The Americans kept climbing. The terrain was difficult. The defenders had fortified the approaches. Every step upward exposed attacking soldiers to fire from above. But the American army had momentum, and it had overwhelming resources. The defensive line began to collapse. The fighting moved closer and closer to the fortress. Inside were soldiers who knew the position was becoming impossible to hold. Among them were the cadets of the military academy. And as the situation deteriorated, orders to withdraw were given, but not everyone left. 6 cadets would eventually become the central figures of the Mexican story of Chapultepec: Juan de la Barrera, Juan Escatilla, Francisco Marquez, Agustin Melgar, Fernando Montes de Oca, and Vicente Suarez. They became known as the Niños Héroes. Mexican national tradition remembers them as young defenders who refused to abandon Chapultepec. And one story became especially famous. According to later tradition, Juan Escatilla took the Mexican flag and wrapped himself in it before falling from the fortress rather than allowing it to be captured. It's an unforgettable image. A teenager, a collapsing fortress, an approaching enemy, and a national flag disappearing over the edge of the hill. But there's an important historical caveat. That specific story is contested. Historians have questioned whether the event happened exactly as later tradition described it. And that's important to understand. Because Chapultepec isn't powerful because every detail of the legend can be proven. It's powerful because the battle itself was real. The assault was real. The cadets were there. And the fortress really did fall. And now comes the part most people miss. If the Mexicans knew they couldn't save Chapultepec, why defend it at all? The answer changes the entire story. They weren't trying to stop the American army forever. They were trying to slow it down, because behind Chapultepec was Mexico City. American troops finally reached the summit. The defensive positions collapsed. The fighting became close and brutal. Chapultepec had fallen. The American flag was raised over the fortress. But the defenders had accomplished something important. They had delayed the American advance. Every hour mattered. Every defensive position that forced the Americans to stop and fight bought additional time for the wider Mexican defense of the capital. But there was no miracle waiting at the end. Chapultepec could not save Mexico City. The American army continued forward. And on September 14, 1847, American forces entered Mexico City. The fall of the capital effectively ended organized Mexican resistance to the American advance. The war would eventually conclude with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico would surrender a vast amount of territory to the United States. The map of North America would be permanently changed. But Chapultepec became remembered for something different. Not victory. Not military genius. Not an impossible battlefield comeback. Sacrifice. Because the strange thing about Chapultepec is this: the defenders lost. The fortress fell. Mexico City fell. And yet, more than a century later, people still remember the young men who stood there. The Niños Héroes became symbols of Mexican courage. And perhaps that's why the story survived. Because military history is usually written around the question, who won? Chapultepec asks a different question. What do you do when you already know you can't win? On that hill in 1847, some defenders chose to stay. And sometimes, history remembers the stand long after it forgets the outcome.